welcome to the Planetious Leaders Walk the Talk. I am Rohit Korat, the founder of Planetious Leaders series, and today we have with us Mr. Mahmoud, who is an expert in climate change adaptation, water policy, and scenario planning. He currently leads the climate and water program at the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's deep dive into the thoughtful conversation, paving the way for the future filled with sustainability. So, given your research focus on impact of climate change across different sectors like agriculture, water resources, and health, how do you take the interdisciplinary approach to develop sustainable solutions? So can you share some examples on how you have brought together like the experts from various disciplines to tackle complex sustainability challenge?
Absolutely. First, Rohit, thanks for engaging in this conversation. Happy to talk through these very pressing issues of our time, really.
Yeah.
Well, you raise a good point. I think to answer your question, it's also important to highlight that sustainability and sustainability is a big bucket when we think about it, right? And so, but even within the context of sustainability, different aspects of sustainability aren't in a vacuum on their own, right? The areas that I focus on as it relates to climate, well, there's intersections of climate, water, environment, and there's aspects of all of those that are important to meeting sustainability goals. One of the things, if you're asking about a specific project or work that I did in my past that looks at multidisciplinary, multidimensional aspects of achieving aspects of sustainability, specifically in this case, climate adaptation. One of the things that I was involved in earlier in my career when I used to work for a water conservation district in Arizona, in the United States, Western United States. One of the things that was still sort of developing in the water industry is the idea of how do you incorporate climate change and climate information into water planning. Some utilities had already done that, at least in the United States, some of the more progressive utilities. The utility I was working for hadn't really embraced that quite yet. So I took it upon myself to sort of champion this idea of developing a climate adaptation plan for our water utility. And to do that, one of my pathways to exploring that wasn't just looking at the impacts of climate on water and energy, which is the areas, resources we dealt with, that's the obvious part. But I brought in experts from across different disciplines associated with the organization. So it wasn't just water engineers, water operators, energy experts. We brought in maintenance specialists. We brought in folks that deal with the business side of the organization, financial planning. We brought in people that deal with the legal aspects, human resources. And the reason I bring this example up is it demonstrated that we were able to think through the impact of something like climate change and how a water utility would adapt to it in more than the conventional engineering dimensions, but looked at how does it affect our staffing, how does it affect our health and safety, how does it affect our environmental work, and doing it in a way that was actually very functional as part of an organization that deals day to day with providing water to end user customers. So that was our first foray into how do we mainstream something like climate adaptation into water management, but also in different disciplines that support water management objectives.
Okay. So how do you navigate the interface between the scientific research and policy making, and what strategies do you employ to ensure that the work that your work informs and shapes sustainability focused policies and regulations?
It's a great question. The interface of science and policy has always been an issue of mine from very early on. In fact, from my own academic career, when I was working on my PhD, my focus area was scenario planning for water resources decision making. And even then, was working with water utilities as a student and how to incorporate science aspects into their day-to-day management and policy, water policy related work, and later climate policy related work. In my most recent role with the Middle East Institute, Director of the Climate and Water Program, I was doing exactly that. It's a think tank, so a lot of the work is policy driven. Certainly we worked on the interface of climate, water policy, environmental policy, the idea being to inform decision makers. But since our work is more technical, right, if you think about the water, climate, environmental field, there's a more technical aspect to it than, say, the politics of a regular think tank or the type of political work they do. To make sure that what we were saying was both credible and relevant, a lot of our work was grounded in actual research, technical research, and analysis. So we took a lot of the work that was developed, myself, who came also from academic background, from universities and actual technical researchers and analysts, and used that to put out policy work and papers to make certain points and to establish certain concepts and ideas that are relevant for the policy space. And what I used to always tell my scholars, sort of the staff and people that are working with me, is that we're almost science whisperers, right? The interface of policy and science is taking something that is so complex to the average person, not that they can't understand it, but they don't necessarily absorb information that way, and packaging it in a way that they can appreciate and anybody can understand, especially those that are in the policy realm. So that's sort of how we've been able to navigate that space.
Yeah. Amazing experience. Okay. So can you tell us about a specific community or stakeholders engagement project you have been involved in, and like where you closely work with the local leaders and residents to co-create climate adaptation and sustainability plans?
Yeah, I mean, the first example we talked about was a sort of a cross-section of that. This idea of, we specifically brought in experts from across the organization and disciplines to put together and contribute towards developing a climate adaptation plan. Of course, it was particularly for the utility, but we have to remember the organization I was part of was servicing customers, right? So we're providing water to cities who then provide water to end users like you and I, actual residents, as well as agricultural districts, and in the case of Arizona, Native American communities. So even though it was developed in the context of the organization with multidisciplinary experts and participants, the end goal is we were trying to improve the reliability and sustainability of our operation and function as a water provider to the benefit of our customers, who represent an even more diverse and cross-cutting section of society.
Okay, amazing. Yeah. Okay, so you have likely collaborated with researchers and organizations around the world. Okay, so can you share an example of successful global partnership that has amplified the impact of your sustainability-focused work?
Of course. One of the really nice things of the work that I was doing over the last 3 years under the context of the Climate and Water Program in the Middle East Institute. It's a regional focus, certainly, as indicated by the title of the institute, but even our program. And we've been fortunate that recruited an amazing group of people to work on these issues, but have also engaged a lot in the region, not just in terms of producing content and analysis on climate, water, environmental issues that are relevant to the region, but actually also physically being in the region, talking to people, engaging with people from the region, not just producing content from far away. And through that interaction and through that interfacing, we've been able to engage and meet and work with a wide range of people representing not just expertise, right? I mean, like I said, the bucket is large when it comes to stuff like sustainability and climate and water. So it wasn't just folks focused on energy transition, on the climate mitigation side, fossil fuel emissions, of course, the primary focus of current global climate efforts, but on the adaptation side, interfacing with ministries, representatives of government, other think tanks, institutions, academics, students, local community folks. And so this work is very cross-cutting, and we've been fortunate as part of it in the region, at least in the context of the Middle East, to work with a variety of people to further those goals across the board.
Okay. So, how do you work to inspire and mentor the next generation of scientists, policymakers, and practitioners?
Yeah, this is an important and personal perspective of mine that you ask in this question. You know, one of the things I've noticed in my career is, unfortunately, a lot of times, those that are, young and very ambitious and with good intention, I say those things in terms of trying to provide and contribute their best in terms of addressing critical issues of our time. Certainly in this context, we're talking about how to address the climate crisis and its many, many tentacles to many other related issues. Unfortunately, progress is usually prohibited by those that want to dwell in the past. And there are, many instances in my career where, as I was trying to advance things for the further good, people that instead of helping to lift me up, kind of stood in the way. And so I learned from that experience. And one of the ultimately positive things is I also learned that for every one person in your path, there's 10 people that are, for every one person in your way, there's 10 people that are standing with you. And so I took that experience, and one of my personal goals, one of the personal things I like to do, because I've lived through that experience, is trying to not be the roadblock to others that are behind me that are trying to get ahead. And so that's one of the things I tend to focus on, is giving opportunities to those that usually have not been given opportunities, not because of a lack of skill or aptitude, but simply because others stood in their way, that instead of helping them, block their path for whatever ill-intentioned reasons. Usually, unfortunately, is the case. And so, when you look at the people I tend to work with, and it's not just a matter of age and experience, there are many people that are skilled and can contribute and provide. And so certainly we're talking more in the context of younger people, or people that are earlier in their career phase, or just starting on this path, even if they're maybe not young in terms of age, and they have their heart in the right place and they're well-intentioned. I always ask, well, if they're willing to contribute, if they're willing to add value, how can I help them get on their journey and help them open up more opportunities for themselves? Because I used to be them, and I don't want to be that person that prohibits progress for personal and selfish reasons.
Right. Okay, so that's great. So coming to the your expertise and the regional focus on the Middle East and North America, how is the water scarcity impacting the MENA region, and what innovative adaptation strategies are urgently needed to address these critical issues?
Well, the interesting thing about the Middle East and North Africa region, even if you put to the side right now the amplifying impacts of climate change on water resources, and we know there's a connection there, that it's stressing water supplies even further just because of warming and all that. The region has already historically been prone to be water deficient. Of course, the region isn't homogeneous. Certain parts of the region have access to more water resources than others, but generally speaking, it's a region that has historically been hot and dry, and mostly deficient in terms of freshwater supplies. So generally, the region has been disproportionately and historically reliant on groundwater. Surface rivers and surface water isn't prevalent across all parts of the region, although there's two and a half maybe, but two major river systems that exist. Certainly everybody knows about the Nile River Basin in North Africa, Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, and upstream of that, and also the Tigris-Euphrates system linking all the way between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, with tributaries in Iran as well. But really, the region has already been hot and dry and has been stressed. Of course, climate change is amplifying, and so for good or for bad, the region has already been conditioned to dealing with drought. In fact, one of the ways it has done that, and has done that significantly in most of the coastal parts of the region, is their early investment and dependence on desalination. Certainly when you look at places like the Arabian Peninsula, that's a place that's almost entirely devoid of any surface systems and has been, tapping into groundwater for a long time. That is one of the most active places in the world in terms of desalination. In fact, the Arabian Gulf, the waters of the Arabian Gulf, that region, is the source of almost 50% of the world's freshwater desalination. Just to tell you, to put into perspective how much it is there. Of course, we can go into other areas of how do you address the water issue. There's demand management, right? To become water efficiency. There's projects there in the region. Water recycling, things like wastewater reuse. So there's active efforts in the region, but I would say desalination has been the most prominent and relied on non-conventional water supply.
Okay. So what are the barriers to securing adaptation, like finance in the form of the grants for the MENA region, and how can these challenges be effectively addressed?
I think climate financing in general has been a challenging topic for a variety of reasons. One, there's the issue of, we've identified, we as in the world, certain organizations, UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has identified the amount of funding needed to address the gap in climate action, both in terms of climate mitigation, so how do you reduce emissions, and then climate adaptation, how do you deal with the impacts of climate change in the interim. The conclusion really is that we are very short in terms of meeting that goal, and part of that is because countries, the idea is that developed countries would take on more of that responsibility towards developing countries. So you look towards the global north, that financing significant amount of it, majority of it really, should be coming from the global north to the global south. And global south, of course, includes the Middle East region, as well as places like South Asia, where you are right now. But unfortunately, those commitments have been slow and not as steady. There has been progress in recent year, and certainly when we were at the COP28 meeting in Dubai, that there was a lot of financial commitments in terms of things like the Green Climate Fund, which has been around, but certainly more project-based. But then also this idea of the loss and damage fund that kind of came as an idea, developed or landed as an idea in COP27 in Egypt. But the issue is, again, how do these funds work and what are they meant to address? And also the delay in the funding sources in terms of meeting those goals. And the Middle East is affected in that way. In fact, a lot of the efforts in Dubai in COP28 that sort of launched all of these climate financing goals and then added further commitments was actually spearheaded by the UAE as host initial pledge in several of those funding mechanisms. The world shouldn't have to wait for someone else, certainly a nation in the global south, to lead that effort. The West and the global north has their obligations to do that. There's no need for further incentive. We need to sort of mobilize. We know what the goal is. We know what the deficiency is. We just need to start funding it. And it's simple as that.
What factors contribute to the reluctance to address environmental degradation in the MENA region? And how can global consensus be achieved to address these critical issues?
Well, when you look at environmental degradation in the MENA region, it's a very complex and mixed issue. It's not one thing, right? So there's several aspects of environmental degradation, and some are very specific, right? So a very extremely site, country, history, event specific example is we can talk about, I'll just use the example of talking about some of the other ones. For example, in Kuwait, post the first Gulf War, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and during the liberation period, there was a lot of burning of those oil fields, which resulted in a significant environmentally devastating amount of that oil spill on the land, on the soil, infiltrating deep.
Yeah.
Surprising for many to hear is that environmental remediation is still ongoing. Kuwait is still slowly but surely addressing efforts to do that environmental cleanup. But you got to think this is decades ago when this happened. So the longer this persists, the more difficult that cleanup is, the more pervasive, the more entrenched. And so that's certainly one example. The other one, which I think is more current, more relevant in current times, which is also quite alarming, is the environmental degradation because of the warming of the waters due to climate change. You know, the Middle East region is close to the equator. That part of the world absorbs more heat, not just on land, but also on the ocean. And parts of those waters, certainly the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, the Red Sea, and now, unfortunately, places even like the Mediterranean Sea, which usually don't link that as much with, those waters are warming more significantly. We're seeing affecting things like corals. There's a lot of coral bleaching. It's affecting marine life in terms of algae bloom, which creates a competition between existing marine life and the algae in terms of absorbing oxygen in the water, dissolved oxygen. So fish species are being affected. So to me, a lot of the more relevant environmental degradation in the modern context sense is associated with climate change, and certainly how it's warming the waters. There's more examples we can talk about, but I just highlight a couple, small and large, of what the region is facing.
So what role can local communities play in promoting climate resilience and adaptation measures in the MENA region, and how can their involvement be effectively facilitated?
Well, I've always been of the view that climate adaptation is an effort that occurs at all levels. Of course, when we think of climate mitigation, this idea of reducing carbon emissions, that's a big goal, and that tends to be on the national level, right? So you see a lot of countries submit what they call national determined contributions, which are basically a country's commitment to the world on how it will reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. That mostly is a larger initiative. When we think about climate adaptation, that can happen at the government level, at the municipality level, and actually, in my opinion, more effectively at the citizen and local level. Because the idea of adaptation is, those two things work together, right? So if the nation and the larger regional community, not communities, but countries and leadership are putting together plans and action to reduce emissions, because that's related to industry and things that are bigger than the scope of one person, adaptation can occur at any level because it's dealing with the effects of climate change. We all deal with the effects of climate change as individuals, as communities. And so, to me, there is no excuse where individually each of us can do something or several things to address climate, because I think we do. I mean, ultimately, none of us want to suffer negative impacts of extreme heat. None of us want to suffer negative impacts of extreme weather events. And none of us want to suffer the impacts of drought. So there are things we can do to deal with it, not necessarily address it. That's where climate mitigation addresses the big picture. But things like, for example, at a very local resident level, being more water efficient, right? Not using as much water as we have, using as much water as we need. I mean, this is probably more applicable in developed nations than developing nations, where there's many communities that struggle to have safe and clean drinking water. But those of us that have abundance have a responsibility to manage it, right? Similarly, in terms of issues with extreme weather, we've seen in the news over the last month the enormous amount of rainfall that fell on the Arabian Peninsula and the damage and flooding it caused. Having preparation plans against that. How do you deal with that? Because unfortunately, that could become more frequent in a climate in a world that is severely impacted by climate change. Even things associated with extreme heat. A lot of places, most of the world is getting warmer. Certainly the global average has been increasing and is projected to increase. How do we individually deal with that? Well, looking at ways in how we work, avoid being outdoors in the sun, doing things to keep our homes cooler without necessarily stressing the energy grid. So there's so many examples, that can be done at a local level. Others, for example, shifting to solar, people installing solar panels at their homes so they don't rely on the energy grid as much. Because then that drives emissions as well. Where's your energy coming from? A lot of places it's driven by fossil fuel, etc. So there's many examples of how individually, communities, municipalities, cities can develop plans to adapt to climate change as opposed to just focusing on the emission side of the equation.
Okay, so amazing. So coming to your accomplishments, we just wanted to have some insights on the cloud seeding, and how it is impacting the scarcity of the water, or the drought conditions.
Well, cloud seeding is a pretty novel approach on basically augmenting water supply. That's its kind of purpose, is how do you enhance existing sources of water. In warmer parts of the world, it's used to enhance rainfall. In other parts of the world that has snow and colder winter weather, it's used to enhance the snowpack, ultimately both through precipitation, right? Rain in warm weather, snow in cold weather. And it's, many may be surprised to know, but the technology has been around since the 1950s. It's not necessarily as new as people think. It's probably new in terms of the mainstream learning about it. It's becoming more visible, and certainly in recent years and decade maybe even, that people are noticing, what's this cloud seeding and weather modification, rain enhancement? But it's been around as a science and a technology for a long time. But there's always misconceptions about cloud seeding. Certainly when the rainfall that occurred in the Arabian Peninsula and the flooding, a lot of people are like, wow, it was triggered by cloud seeding and all that. The short answer is, of course, not. And there's many articles. One just came out recently, a day ago, from my program. One of my scholars produced an article on that, debunking the role of cloud seeding. And people need to understand one thing about cloud seeding. Those that are detractors or misinformation or conspiracy theorists, is that the idea of cloud seeding is to enhance precipitation, whether it's rain or snow. It doesn't have the ability to create something out of nothing. It requires water vapor, which exists in the atmosphere. And yes, although technically speaking, water vapor is finite, it's not as finite as people think it is. This idea of, if we cloud seed here and it rains there, that means we're robbing someone else of that water. That's not how atmospheric physics works. And I understand that people would think that because they don't understand or know the science, but they don't have to at least understand this basic idea concept. It's meant to enhance rainfall or snow in this case, and it doesn't necessarily steal water vapor from the atmosphere. There's a lot of water, and I underline that word, a lot, in the atmosphere. And also, people have to temper their expectations of what cloud seeding does. It is an effective tool, but many studies, and you can look this up online, certainly the Wyoming experiment is one that looks into this, increases precipitation, 5 to 15%. So it can, again, generate something out of nothing and add an enormous amount of volume of precipitation on top of that. But I will also still say, even though the increases from it are modest, when you look at water reliability, water scarcity issues, it's just one tool in the toolbox. It's not a magic bullet that's going to solve water scarcity issues for the reasons I just stated. But when you look and address water deficiency issues, or water scarcity and drought issues, the approach, as water managers all smart water managers will know, you have to have a diverse portfolio of strategies, right? So you look at water augmentation, so things like desalination, you're adding water, things like water recycling, things like cloud seeding, but you also look at how you manage demand. So you do water efficiency projects on different water sectors, urban, agricultural, industrial. You look at water management approaches. Are we efficiently utilizing our water if we have, say, dams and reservoirs or release water at certain times, etc. So cloud seeding is a good strategy. It's not sufficient by itself.